This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot, and the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time.
What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out-of-touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
It's Wednesday Addams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2, begins August 6th, only on Netflix.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
I got a quick question for you. What's your definition of cold case?
I think that there's different levels of cold cases, like, for example, the Mandy Stavik one, where it's in the hearts and minds of a community for 30 years. And so it's never really cold, but technically it is a cold case. And then you have the thousands and thousands and thousands of cold cases that just, it's a one-off murder. And I mean, not to sound callous, but you just don't have any more details. You don't have the resources to follow them up. And it just literally goes cold.
So I always ask that because I'm not a big fan of that term, and it's part of the vernacular, right? We throw it out there, and it was the term was created actually down in Miami by the media to talk about some of the work they were doing on older cases. But, the thing about to me is that sometimes I can give a value judgment on the type of evidence or strength of evidence you have in a case, and also maybe make a statement on whether you're actually actively working it. Because I could tell you that, like, I have a case from July of this summer. It's cold. I've already been dead-ended, and it's really frustrating. With Susan Galvin's case from 1967, I don't know that I would ever call it a cold case because throughout the generations of different detectives, people still continue to work it.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 83, Who Murdered Susan Galvin? It was a Sunday, July 9th, 1967. An absolutely gorgeous day in Seattle, and 20-year-old Susan Galvin was enjoying her favorite pastime, having endless fun at the Seattle Center, which is exactly why she'd moved to the Emerald City from Spokane, which was about 4 hours away. Susan was the oldest of 8 children, and 5 years before, she'd watched what living in Seattle could be like.
Everybody's planning to see Seattle's spectacular $100 million World's Fair. So pack up your troubles and forget your care. Pack up your family and head for the fair in Seattle.
As the 1962 World's Fair was forever immortalized, when Elvis Presley starred in the movie, it happened at the World's Fair, which was released in 1963. That movie and the fair put Seattle on the map.
The World's Fair in Seattle had occurred just a few years earlier, where they built the Space Needle and this kind of social hub in downtown Seattle called Seattle Center. And in that era, that was the place to go for young people. You would go there, you would ride rides, you would just hang out and socialize. It really was kind of the fulcrum of Seattle social activity. And Susan would go there nearly every weekend with her friends, hanging out, talking to boys. She only lived 3 blocks away from the Seattle Center, so it was just essentially right in her backyard.
So did she live in Queen Anne?
She did. She lived in Lower Queen Anne on Aloha Street.
That's Seattle Police Detective Rolf Norton, who says that Susan had landed a job as a records clerk for the Seattle Police Department.
Her brother Larry described described Seattle back in that era for people that live in Spokane as the end of the rainbow. You know, that's where opportunity was. It's where the big city was. And yeah, I mean, for the Pacific Northwest, Seattle was it. And, you know, she, at a very young age, left her family and moved west. She was doing great here. She had her own apartment. She got a steady job. She had an active social life.
Since the Seattle Center was essentially her backyard, Susan would often meet friends at the Fun Forest amusement park, which had rides and games. And then there was the Armory, which housed what was then called the Food Circus. An exciting and fun place to watch a show, enjoy a meal, and to socialize. Susan worked the graveyard shift, which meant she would walk from her apartment through the Seattle Center to catch a bus, which would take her to her job about 1.5 miles away.
Well, we are talking midnight, so, you know, you always look at the dark hours and there's fewer people around, and that can create some safety concerns. But I would say Seattle Center was a fairly innocent place at that point. You know, the rough areas in Seattle in 1967 were really in Skid Row, which is Pioneer Square, and, you know, around the area of First and Pike. There was a lot going on there. But Seattle Center, I would say less so. And so I think during that time, people wouldn't be shocked to hear that, you know, someone like Susan was, you know, making her way to work, going through that area. At the same token, you know, her coworkers did kind of look at her as somewhat fearless in the sense that, hey, it's the middle of the night, she would walk around by herself, and she didn't seem overly concerned about that.
So that sunny, hot day, Susan had spent the afternoon at the Seattle Center. So her shift started at midnight on the night of July 9th, going into the morning of July 10th. But Susan's coworkers started to get worried when she didn't show up for work for 2 days, prompting them to file a missing persons report. And when police started investigating, it was like she'd vanished without a trace.
During this time period from July 9th through the 13th, the Seattle Center parking garage was shut down. Okay, there was nothing going on at the Seattle Center, and if there wasn't any events, they would lock the place up. And on the evening of July 13th, they opened it up for an event at one of the buildings. And at 6:40 in the evening, the parking garage attendant opened the elevators and found Susan deceased in elevator number 1.
Susan Galvin had been raped and murdered.
So she was found deceased on the floor of the elevator, and her legs were splayed apart, and she had been sexually assaulted. The King County coroner's autopsy determined that she died from strangulation.
The coroner surmised that the killer had manually strangled Susan to death in that elevator.
Her regular routine would be she would walk to the Seattle Center parking garage, and she would take the elevator up to an elevated walkway that went over Mercer Street. Then she would cut through Seattle Center and take a bus from there to the public safety building. So her using those elevators and that elevated walkway was something that she did every night.
The murder of Susan Galvin in the summer of 1967 plunged Seattle into a state of disbelief. It was a horrific crime in what had been believed to be a gleaming pocket of safety and security within the city.
You know, Seattle Center, this was pretty shocking that she was found there. And, you know, part of my investigation, I really looked hard and deep at any other violent crimes that occurred in Seattle Center or right in the outskirts during that era. And, you know, what I found was there was much less violence there in Lower Queen Anne around that spot than in other hot spots where it was very clear this is where we're getting the most of our, you know, violent crime going on.
Susan's murder would mark the beginning of a terrifying mystery. Right away, the elevator buttons were dusted for prints. But back then, everything was manual. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, wouldn't be created by the FBI until 1974.
There were fingerprints that were left behind at the scene?
Correct.
So
now, keep in mind that this is a public elevator, a very active, busy public elevator. So latent evidence in itself would not necessarily be significant in the sense that there are hundreds of people coming in and out of that elevator every day, right?
The original crime scene investigators not only meticulously collected evidence at that scene, but they also preserved it, having no idea at the time what it could mean in the future.
You know, they processed that scene in 1967 like it was 2018. Fingerprints experts were brought out. Her clothing was collected and preserved. They did a tremendous job. And, that's one thing, looking back at the case 50 years later, that was so surprising, is that we had evidence that we could do work with. Now, when we have a homicide, there is a process that the medical examiner goes through as far as what they collect and what they keep. Back in 1967, there was not an established process. We did not always collect and preserve the victim's clothing. They did that in this case.
After that, the detectives went about the shoe leather investigative work, beginning with putting together a timeline for Susan's movements, which gave them a lead to run down. The previous weekend, Susan had met up with a couple of sailors at the Seattle Center.
Initially, the detectives learned that Susan had been out on a date the prior weekend at the Seattle Center with a couple of sailors who were stationed on the USS Samuel Gompers. And the primary detectives on this case were Archie Porter and Dave Grayson. They jumped on a ferry, went out to the Navy ship in the middle of the night and interviewed these sailors. The sailors were shocked. They were cooperative. They eventually were given polygraph examinations and passed them, and they were, for the most part, cleared as suspects.
Investigators would also take a hard look at Susan's ex-boyfriend.
Susan also had an on and off boyfriend that she knew from Spokane, who I'll call Jay. And Jay had some troubles going on in his personal life. And as a matter of fact, Susan, one night when she was going through the police reports, randomly saw his name on one when he was arrested for possession of LSD or being under the influence of LSD. And she was shocked and actually ended their relationship after that. Though their relationship had ended, I think, a few weeks before she was found. And so the detectives interviewed Jay. He provided an alibi which was verified, and he was also cleared as a suspect.
Investigators began digging into the employees at the Seattle Center, particularly those who would have access to that parking garage at 11:45 at night. They would also canvass the park, speaking with employees at the amusement park and the food circus. And one name kept coming up: Punchy.
They had several individuals who said they saw Susan walking with the Seattle Center clown on the afternoon of Sunday, July 9th, and others who said that they had seen her walking with the Seattle Center clown on other prior occasions. And the clown was employed by the Seattle Center to entertain kids, to make the rounds, to sell trinkets, to just be present in what I would call a carnival atmosphere. And it wasn't just on weekends. He worked there on most days. So this is a clown in the classic sense, all dressed up with makeup and big shoes and all of that.
They needed to talk to the clown, especially after they learned that Punchy had abruptly quit his job just 2 days after Susan had been found murdered.
They brought him in for questioning, and he was somewhat problematic. He was aloof. He did not seem like he was taking the process seriously, kind of deflecting questions, and he ultimately was given a polygraph examination. And while he did not fail it, his results were deemed inconclusive.
Detectives were troubled by the clown. He'd been seen walking around with Susan not only the day that she'd been murdered, but even before that. And during his interview with police, not only was he acting suspicious, but he claimed he'd never even met Susan. So why did he just out of the blue quit his job after she was found murdered?
He said he got fed up with his boss and it was time for a change. So it's unclear to me, based on the documentation of the interviews with him, whether the clown ever conceded knowing her or not. He certainly didn't say, yes, I was walking with her holding her hand. Now, did he know that a female had been murdered and found in the Seattle Center? Yes, certainly he did.
The clown didn't confess, and there was no physical evidence tying him to Susan's murder, so he was free to go. Investigative work would continue. People would be interviewed and re-interviewed, but nothing would come of it. Years later, when APHIS was up and running, those fingerprints that had been collected in the elevator would be uploaded into the database, but there weren't any hits. And still, tips would come in, because Susan's murder stuck with people, especially those within the Seattle Police Department, because she was considered one of their own.
This murder caught the attention of the city of Seattle, and people called in for many years afterwards saying, hey, what about this? What about this? I heard this. What do you think about this?
What is it about certain cases that stay on people's minds?
I think it was a combination of factors. Number one, her youth and innocence. 20 years old, just starting her life as a young adult, moving to Seattle from the east side. the fact that this happened at the Seattle Center. Clearly, someone not involved in any criminal activity whatsoever. She was on her way to work, and at that point did not know if it was a random attack or someone that knew her, but still quite shocking. This is the place where our youth and our young adults came to congregate and hang out. It was known this is where you go, and this is kind of considered a safe place. This is an innocent place. I think the fact that she was a Seattle police employee.
Yeah, she would definitely be considered one of your own, for sure.
Yeah, and I would say that both how detectives in the department looked at it, but also the community. I mean, it's kind of shocking. She wasn't out at the Seattle Center doing anything wrong. She was on her way to work, as a public servant.
Everything would change in the early 2000s. A couple SPD detectives were tasked with looking into unsolved homicides with an eye on sexual assault murders where the offender could have left his DNA behind. Susan's clothing and autopsy swabs were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA analysis in June of 2002, and the lab found male DNA on Susan's underwear. The DNA was entered into CODIS, but there was no hit. However, investigators hoped that maybe one day they'd get a match. You see, the protocol is that once that DNA profile had been submitted into that database, it will stay there, with the hopes that if the offender was arrested for something else and his DNA was submitted into CODIS after the fact, that would trigger a hit. But the years continued to roll on. Until 2016. And Detective Rolf Norton was assigned to work what he likes to refer to as older unsolved cases. So many cold cases. But where to begin?
I inherited an office full of murder books and case files and just was grabbing the ones that were closest to the desk, thinking, okay, this is here, there must be a reason why it's here. And one of our admin employees in homicide, Leslie Thornburg, she stopped me one day and said, hey, what do you know about a Seattle Police Records clerk that was murdered in the late 1960s? And I told Leslie, I know nothing about that. I've never heard of it.
Rolf went down to a place called The Vault, where all the old cases were stored. Investigations that no one was working on. Rolf would peruse revolving bookshelves filled with cold cases, searching the way back for the year 1967.
So Susan's case was 2 accordion files, and I checked it out, brought it up to my office and started reading, and there was a lot. I was really surprised, and I was really intrigued. I saw a lot of potential. So I just started going through all the names in the murder book, saying, okay, who's available? Is there anyone here where there's probable cause for me to get a warrant? What can I do to match specific individuals to this profile that we have here at WSP? And the first person that jumped out was the Seattle Center clown. So I got a search warrant to collect his DNA. I located him in Salt Lake City, and I flew down there, and with the assistance of Salt Lake City PD, we served the warrant, collected his DNA, and I re-interviewed him. When I interviewed him in 2016, that he denied ever having any sort of relationship or friendship with her.
Wow, so he was on your guys' radar for quite a while.
Definitely. When I started working the case in 2016, the first thing I started doing is going through and saying, hey, who looked the most suspicious, who were the initial detectives hottest on, and the Seattle Center clown was at the top of the list.
But it wasn't a match.
There wasn't any proof that he did it, but just because of his demeanor, sometimes people just act weird, right? They don't act the way that we think that they should, and so therefore they get put on lists. What do you think about this clown in the case? If there would have been more bad evidence against him, he could have gone down for it.
Looking at it from a probable cause perspective, in the sense of having enough evidence to get a search warrant, it was more than just a demeanor or a reaction to the questioning. We had witnesses saying, we saw a homicide victim walking with him at the Seattle Center, essentially 800 meters away from where she was found, just hours before we believed she was killed. And then we had other individuals stating that they believed that they had been previously, the clown and Susan, previously associated with each other. And then you have the clown abruptly quitting his job within a day or two after she was found. So that's incredibly suspicious to me. And obviously,
I completely agree.
The Superior Court judge agreed too. But it wouldn't have been enough to get a conviction.
I know, but sometimes, and again, I'm sorry that I'm an armchair detective here. There's detectives that they set their sights on somebody, and then it's like, oh, well, it fits. And it's kind of that, I'm just glad you guys didn't have that kind of bias, the confirmation bias.
In this case, we collected his DNA and went to the state lab, and Lisa Collins was still working it as a scientist, and within 2 weeks she cleared the clown from being involved. So, in this way, our investigation exonerated someone that we had suspicions about. So I think that, he was handled appropriately, and I think that was from making sure the wrong people aren't brought in. I think we addressed that.
Absolutely, yes.
Glad that we had that science so we could say, hey, he's not involved. Because even when I interviewed him in 2016, he behaved suspiciously. He denied knowing or having any relationship with Susan, and we believe that wasn't true. Now, certainly, many years later, when a homicide detective knocks on your door, you have a vested interest in trying to separate yourself from, someone who was a victim of violent crime. But again, his actions didn't help him in any way, and to the very end, he reacted suspiciously. And I'm very grateful that we had the science to be able to say yes or no.
Shout out to Astapro for sponsoring this episode and providing us with free samples. This morning, I literally woke up with a runny, stuffy nose. In fact, it was so bad that my son came in and said, "Hey, Mom." And as I was talking, he was like, "Why is your nose whistling?" If you're a longtime allergy sufferer like me, then you'll know why. The whole one nostril plugged, the other one nearly so, except one little pocket of breathing space that sort of whistles as I breathe. I don't have time for this, and neither do you, which is why I use Astapro, and you should too. Astapro is a first-of-its-kind nasal allergy spray. It is the fastest 24-hour over-the-counter allergy spray. It starts working in 30 minutes, while other allergy sprays take hours. And Astapro is the first and only 24-hour steroid-free allergy spray. And Astapro delivers full prescription strength indoor and outdoor allergy relief from nasal congestion, runny and itchy nose, and sneezing. A combination that's not so fun. I use Astapro whenever my nasal allergies flare up, and I'm always so amazed and grateful at how fast I am back in the game, which is why I trust that Astapro always has my back, and more importantly, my nose. Get fast-acting nasal allergy symptom relief with Astapro. Go to astaproallergy.com for a discount so you can Astapro and go today. That's ASTEPRO allergy.com. Astapro and go. Use as directed for relief of nasal congestion, runny nose, sneezing, and itchy nose due to allergies. They've done studies and it takes about a solid 2 months to create a good habit, which in the scheme of things doesn't sound long at all when you consider the long-term benefits of whatever it is you're trying to do. For many of us, doesn't it always come down to eating right and stress? For me, they go hand in hand. Because around day 4 to 5, you've had a rough go of it. Maybe your boss is a jerk, your commute stunk, fill in the blank. And then you get home, and you don't want to cook because you didn't go grocery shopping. And even if you had, you don't want any of that stuff. You want a delicious, ooey gooey cheeseburger and fries. That'll make you feel better. But that's the thing. You and me both know it doesn't. So how do you stay on track when the stresses of life get you down and you're busy or tired or meh and you don't feel like cooking? Factor. Factor offers 2-minute meals that are restaurant quality and ready to heat and eat wherever and whenever you are. And you can get as much or as little as you need by choosing your meals every single week, which are delivered right to your door. So quit with the excuses and do something good for yourself. Give Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals a try. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef-crafted and ready to go in just 2 minutes. You'll have over 35 different options to choose from, including Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. So what are you waiting for? Get started today and get after your goals. Head to factormeals.com/mischief50. That's MISCHIEF 50 and use code mischief50 to get 50% off. That's code mischief50 at factormeals.com/mischief50 to get 50% off. Now, Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. And with Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth, which means you can track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. You're connecting with customers inline and online. Shopify is also all about driving store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns from TikTok to Instagram and beyond. And Shopify makes it so easy to get the hardware you need that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone, transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system, or use Shopify's POS Go mobile device for a battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/mischief. That's MISCHIEF, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/mischief to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/mischief.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
But one thing he believed for sure, the name of the killer had to be in that murder book. Just based on the thoroughness of the initial investigation and the sheer number of people who were investigated and also all the witness interviews. But then something amazing happened. The Golden State Killer case broke in 2018, a cold case that was solved through investigative genetic genealogy.
And I remember exactly where I was. I was driving in the Midwest and just listening to some radio show, and this all broke, and they explained how it worked, and I had not heard of it, at least used in homicide investigations, maybe used in unidentified human remains situations. But, I just about jumped out of my car seat and thought of at least a half a dozen cases back in Seattle that I thought could potentially be addressed using the strategy.
Rolf could barely contain his excitement, but he knew he still needed to get the sign-off from his command staff in order to send the most promising, old, unsolved cases to Parabon Labs to see if any of them would meet the criteria for a genetic genealogy workup.
Right away found out that the sample in Susan Galvin's case did meet the criteria to be able to use the strategy. And that was the oldest case that I had submitted, and it's just crazy to think that, this underwear that had been sitting in an evidence vault for, from 1967 to 2002, had this sample that we could do these, unbelievable things with.
Cece Moore was assigned to the case.
I'm Cece Moore. I'm the Chief Genetic Genealogist for Parabon Nanolabs. I'm also the longtime genetic genealogist on the PBS TV series Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. And I'm the founder of the DNA Detectives. I have a huge Facebook group for people looking to use their DNA to solve family mysteries. And I am co-founder of the Institute for Genetic Genealogy, which focuses on educating about genetic genealogy. And we typically have an annual conference.
Cece is considered to be a pioneer in the use of DNA investigative genetic genealogy. And the first thing she does is uploads the suspect's DNA profile into GEDmatch, which is an ancestry and genealogy website that's helped police departments across the nation solve cold cases, including the Golden State Killer investigation. The suspect's profile is compared against all the participants in that database, and the results weren't great. Cece found just 2 distant cousins who matched the suspect's genetic profile. The cousins became her starting point, and she worked backwards until she found a man who was born in 1828 in Kentucky and a woman born in Missouri in 1837, from whom both of the distant cousins were descended. She then followed the generations forward from that ancestral couple.
So I really didn't have much to work with. What ended up being key in this case is we get these matches, these people who share DNA, but we also can predict someone's ancestral origins. So where did their ancestors come from? In this case, we had about 16% Native American ancestry, and then we had about 43% Eastern European ancestry, with the rest being the typical Northwest European ancestry that we're working with. And so that told me I not only had to find a relative of these top 2 matches, who's related to both of them, but that person has to have most likely a great-grandparent who's fully Native American, and they need to have probably a parent who is Eastern European. And so I had to find a descendant of these matches' ancestors who fit into that. So I was looking for someone who married someone with Native American ancestry, who married someone with Eastern European ancestry. And I could tell from the match list that the Eastern European was going to be Polish. It's so much about putting the puzzle pieces together, and it becomes less and less about the DNA. That starts us out. How much do 2 people share? What's the likely relationship? And then everything else is genealogy, building the trees, finding the common ancestors, finding the descendants, and then who's in the right place at the right time, right gender, right hair color, eye color, because we also get those predictions at Parabon. Who is most likely to be this contributor of this DNA, this unknown suspect. And in this case, it all came down only to 1 person who fit all the parameters to be that suspect.
This process had taken Cece a couple of months, but getting a name was just the beginning.
Once I have completed that genetic genealogy analysis, I write up a report because I want to explain how I got there so they can really understand how all the pieces came together. And in this case, understand that it's a really high confidence potential identification, but it's still just a lead. This is not evidence for court. This is to point the detective and the agency in the right direction, and then they have to do their own investigation. So we write this report, and then we set up a briefing, and I go over it all with them and tell them what I found and how confident in this case I feel that this is going to be the guy. But then they've got to go out and vet that, confirm or refute theory. And it's only a theory, it's only a lead. Just like if someone picked up the phone and called Crime Stoppers and said, hey, I think this is your guy. They've got to treat it like that. And so it's still a lot of work after I've narrowed it down to this person. Detective Norton had to go out and really look into that and say, is this a viable lead? Does this make sense?
Detective Rolf Norton remembers getting Cece's report.
So I started reading, and it's a long report, and I got to a certain page where she wrote, and we believe the suspect is Frank Wibbage. And I have to tell you, I was hoping to get a list of 100 names to go start knocking people out, just reaching out to them saying, hey, your name came up. Do you mind? Can I get a swab? She was looking at 1 name, and it certainly wasn't a done deal, but it's not what I expected at all.
So you were hoping to get a bunch of names so that you could run them down and you could, because you thought that would give you a better percentage chance of finding someone, and then just to see the one. I mean, that's like, what was your thought process there?
I wanted a lot of names because I wanted work to do. I didn't want to get dead-ended, like, a shrug of the shoulders and, hey, there's no names. I'd say it's harder if there's more names, right? But that creates opportunity. There's work to be done. Case isn't dead-ended. I didn't think that the potential suspect would be so specific.
Well, and also look at it too. I mean, I could totally see why you would say that. Like, yeah, I can roll up my sleeves and dig into this. I've got lots to work with. When you've got one name and she's looked through, and that one name probably was not on any in that murder book, anywhere in that murder book, right? And so it just was like, how could someone get that specific with one sample that's not in CODIS? I mean, it just is like such a long shot, right?
Yes, and to your point, I spent the weekend, as soon as I got this report, going through the murder book again, every name. And, I mean, there's hundreds, if not 1,000 pages in these files, and Frank Whippach's name was not in there.
Frank Whippach, who at the time of Susan's murder was a married Seattle security guard who may have worked at the Seattle Center. He was 26 at the time of Susan's murder and a father of one. He would eventually go on to have a second child, and then he divorced his wife. Rolf would find out that Frank Whippach, his one and only suspect, had died in 1987 from complications due to diabetes. Whippach had never been considered a suspect in Susan's murder before the DNA link was established. But here's the thing about genetic genealogy. It's not a slam dunk. On its own, it's merely a tip.
And because this person was deceased in this case, he had to figure out how he could get DNA to confirm or refute my theory. That's the ultimate step, is they've got to get a DNA profile to compare against their traditional forensic profile, the one that is admissible in court. So at the time of this case, it was quite early, and we hadn't tested that out yet. We had our position that we felt this really is just a lead generator. It's a tip. It's a highly scientific tip, but still that's all it is. And so for there to be an arrest and a conviction, there has to be other types of evidence. And the kind of linchpin to that is them getting that DNA from that person that we've pointed them toward and comparing it against their traditional profile. And that is what the courts have always accepted as evidence. Genetic genealogy is not evidence. It's like I keep saying, it's just a lead generator or a tip. And so we were hoping that's how the courts and the juries would see it, but we didn't know yet in 2018.
So the next phase in the investigation would begin, proving that their suspect was the murderer posthumously. Rolf found out that Frank Whippach had been arrested and convicted in the early 1970s for felony theft. But that was it. At some point, he'd been picked up for a weapons charge by Seattle police, but there was no record of it. However, family members would shed some light on that arrest, saying that he'd been picked up for impersonating a police officer.
So he was born in 1941, so he would have been 46 when he died. Frank Whippach grew up in Seattle. He went to a secondary school for what was then called mentally handicapped students, and that's straight off their website. And it was a school whose purpose was to offer students training in vocational fields that wouldn't necessarily be successful in traditional academic environments. I don't know anything about what his challenges were. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1960. He was stationed in New York, Alaska, and Germany. And he was married in the mid-60s, had 2 offspring during that era, and then divorced in the early 70s when he was arrested and convicted for felony theft. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but that sentence was reduced to 9 months. At some point in the mid-70s, he was arrested for a weapons offense in Seattle. There's no record of the report wasn't kept, but according to his family, the story that's been shared through the generations that he was arrested for impersonating a police officer and making traffic stops in his personal vehicle armed with a gun. Other than that, he did not have any convictions or other criminal history.
So the 9-month stint that he did, what year was that?
1971.
So it was after he killed her.
Yes,
I was
so
going to
it's 4
say
years
that
after.
would have been a real bitter pill if he should have been in prison for 15 years, got out in 9 months, and then did that.
Yeah, no, that wasn't the case.
Oh, that's good. That's something.
Since the suspect, Frank Whippach, was dead, Rolf looked to his 2 adult children to connect him to that DNA that had been collected from Susan's underwear so long ago.
How do you address this? How do you go contact someone and say, I'm investigating your father and I'm hoping you will give me a DNA sample so I can determine whether or not your father was involved in a murder from 50-some years ago.
Yeah, that's a challenge, to say the least.
If someone knocked on my door and said that, I'm not sure what my reaction would be. Probably my reaction would be, which relative are you investigating? But, there's no textbook on how you address that, or probably no right or wrong way to do it.
Rolf set his sights on one of the suspect's adult children who lived about 2 hours away from Seattle. And over the next month, he would make multiple trips out to their home trying to connect.
So it ended up being these super long drives, and invariably I try to do it on the weekend just to hopefully have a better chance of making contact with the individual. And so during these drives, the first few times, I would kind of replay a dialogue in my head and try to have something practiced out that I was going to say. And I went to this residence numerous times with no one ever answering the door.
Oh my
at least 3
gosh.
weeks. So I kept going back and forth. And I would keep chewing on this process over and over again, and try to time it when there's a NFL playoff game or something I can listen to on the radio. But it was starting to drive me a little crazy, and I so wanted to either get shut down or be successful. And ultimately, I said, screw it. I'm not going to keep replaying a dialogue. I'm just going to get face to face with this person and just start talking. I still could never find anyone at the residence. I ended up locating a place of employment and just waited outside. And the offspring individual ended up coming out late at night, and I just got out of the car, introduced myself, said, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm investigating a relative for a very violent crime that happened many decades ago, and I'm hoping to get your DNA to either confirm that your relative was involved or exclude your relative from being involved. Are you willing to do that? And there was no hesitation. The offspring said yes.
Wow. That says a lot about the kid. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It is.
He sent that DNA sample to the crime lab, and within 4 days, he got word. The offspring's DNA was a match.
So what we now have determined is that our murder suspect is related to this offspring. Is there a possibility there's another relative that we're not aware of? Is there someone else in this family tree that's out there, right? We're not to home plate yet as far as identifying Susan's killer without a doubt.
You might already have imagined what the next step was. They needed to go to the source, to Frank Whippich.
I got a search warrant to exhume Whippich's remains on February 22nd, 2019, and then we conducted the exhumation on the 26th of February, so 4 days later. Now, he had been buried since 1987. This is a very wet climate. Water and DNA do not mix well. We did not know what we were going to find. I fully expected to find a puddle of water and, potentially be sifting through for whatever we could find. There was a very strong likelihood that we were not going to be successful in being able to find remains that would allow us to get a DNA profile.
Frank Whippich's bones would be sent to a private lab where DNA was extracted and tested. And on April 12, 2019, it would be determined that with 100% certainty, Frank Whippich was the donor of the DNA found in Susan's underwear. But that wasn't the only physical evidence connecting Frank Whippich to Susan's murder.
After we had the name Frank Whippich, I thought back to the latent evidence that's recovered, and I pulled it out of the case file and I sent it to Rachel Forbes in our latent print unit. And just knowing that, hey, this is a public place, this is such a long shot, and really didn't think twice about it other than that's just being thorough. You need to do stuff like that when you have a suspect. And she got back to me within 2 weeks, and she was so casual. She called me on the phone. She was like, hey, that 1967 case? Yeah, I have your guy's prints. And then pause, and I'm like, what? She had to repeat it like 3 or 4 times to me. But I find that just incredible that we had latent print examiners go out to the scene in 67 and pull this stuff off of elevator buttons, and then 50-some years later, our latent people can put it together and say, yes, that is the person. He was in that elevator.
And if you're wondering, why hadn't the fingerprints found in the elevator matched with Whippich when he was arrested for felony theft back in the early 1970s?
it's something that people have asked is, okay, well, you had this latent evidence, and then he was arrested in 1971. How come a match wasn't made at that point? And the reason is the latent evidence we had was a palm print, and palm prints aren't, at least at that point, entered into APHIS for automatic comparison. So we had to pull his latent records associated with his booking directly and have that re-examined, which we did in early 2019.
Finally, after more than 50 years, Detective Rolf Norton would reach out to Susan's family and let them know, at long last, their sister's killer had been identified.
I located one of Susan's brothers, Chris Galvin, and he was living in eastern Washington. And I just called him up and said I had been working on Susan's case and that we had come to a conclusion and we had identified the individual that was responsible for her murder. That individual was deceased, but he had been identified with 100% certainty. I think Chris was shocked. I think he was taking it all in. I think he just listened and was like, wow. And I don't know that he, totally comprehended everything that I had said. My concern was, what am I bringing to the family? I'm bringing up probably was the worst thing that ever happened to that group. And, of course, we're happy that we've completed our mission and that we've identified the suspect, but are we reopening old wounds that don't need to be reopened? I don't know the right answer to that. I just know that if we have information to share, we need to do that. But, and it's important to me to recognize, hey, we can be satisfied that we did our job and came to a conclusion, but you also have to take a step back and show some grace and compassion toward the Galvin family, because it doesn't matter what we do as investigators. We can't bring her back, and we can't take away from the pain and just the horrible tragedy that was brought to their family.
Rolf says that solving Susan Galvin's case was a team effort.
I am incredibly pleased with the result. I also have to say, we did our job, and we should be expected to do that, and I really mean that. I'll also say there was some incredible work, very thorough work, very tenacious work done from the get-go, and everyone that had their hands on this case took actions to allow others in the future to be successful in coming to a resolution.
And Cece Moore.
That this case was of really special interest to me because all of my ancestral lines come through the Seattle area, and both my parents grew up there, and they or any of my relatives could have been a victim in that same way. And I grew up, going up there in the summers and going to the Space Needle. And so when I read this case description, I really wanted to work this case. It meant, all cases mean a lot to me, but this one really hit home for me. And so I have not heard from her family. I'm always thinking about the families of the victims, and I hope that they got some resolution. I don't think you can ever get closure in a violent crime like this, but if it helped them have a little bit of resolution, then it was well worth it.
Stick around for our criminal mischief bonus content up next. This is a place where my co-host Brandon Morgan and I discuss the case and include details that didn't make it into the episode. And if you have a minute, head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the show. And if you really want to go the extra mile, recommend the show to a friend. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.